Welcome to Municipal Affairs. Today we're taking you beyond the Canadian border because challenges don't just stop at the 49th parallel. Municipal leaders are the backbone of our communities, whether in Canada or in the United States. And right now, representatives from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities are wrapping up a week-long delegation trip to Washington, D.C., meeting with American counterparts to reinforce a crucial message. A tariff war would be devastating, not just for businesses, but for workers, families, and entire communities on both sides of the border. Now, this isn't just a big city issue. The economic ripple effects of trade barriers would hit our rural, northern, and remote communities the hardest. Their message to the U.S. stakeholders is simple. We must work together. Because we live in a small town or a major metropolitan hub, whether we call Canada or the United States home, we're neighbors, and neighbors look out for each other. So stay tuned as we sit down and speak with FCM Second Vice President Kathy Valentino, FCM Rural Forum Chair Neil Como, and FCM Director Allison Story as they wrap up these critical discussions in Washington. Thank you so much for sitting down with me, all three of you, on your last day there in Washington, D.C. I want to start with Second Vice President Kathy Valentino, if you don't mind. And I've got to ask you, why was it important for FCM to send a municipal delegation to Washington ahead of the potential incoming tariffs that Donald Trump is going to be imposing on Canada?
Thanks very much, Chris. It's important that FCM sent this because they have their, how do you say, NACO conference going on right now, which is the equivalent to FCM for rural municipalities and their counties, I guess, in the United States. So that's why us having rural municipalities to be here to present to them was a good fit, because we both represent the same demographics, but in different countries.
Neil, for yourself, what was the message that you wanted to bring as the Rural Forum Chair to this conference, to this delegation trip, that you hope to get across to the delegates at the conference that you attended?
I mean, ultimately, we want to get across that the tariffs are harmful to both sides of the border. I would say to a certain success, we reached that. Definitely contacted a lot of people. I'm not going to lie to you, Chris, and say that it was well received by everyone, because there were some people in the crowd that didn't necessarily believe some of the stats we were giving them. We broke it down, I should say, we FCM staff broke it down to really a district level where we could show them that, say in Georgia, as an example, the number one exporter that they have in Georgia is to Canada. So we broke that down for them and showed them that their exports coming across the border, that Canada is a big trade partner, which they all understood, but a lot of them didn't realize how closely connected they are to Canada. So really a great educational tool for us to impart on them. And when I say that not everyone understood it, there are some people that just were sitting in the crowd, I'm going to say, arms crossed, kind of looking at you going, I'm not buying what you're selling today. So we did have a little bit of an uphill battle with a few areas, but in general, I would say, a rough estimate, 70% of the population down here that we dealt with understood it. And that was Republican, Democrat, didn't matter which side of the fence they're on.
Allison, in your conversations with municipal leaders in Washington, did you get a sense that they were open to hearing the Canadian perspective of what this could mean, these tariffs could mean on the Canadian economy as well as the American economy?
Absolutely. That message, especially when you spoke with more of the local officials from border states who are incredibly integrated. Our economies are so closely linked. A lot of them have friends and family in Canada. They do business with Canadians regularly. So we had a lot of conversations like that where those officials were very clearly worried, because they know that if Canada's economy suffers, the U.S. economy is going to suffer as well. So agreeing with Neil, absolutely. The majority of folks we spoke to were well aware of the tariffs. There was a sliding scale of how many sectors in their own communities would be affected. That, I think, was eye-opening for some. We were able to bring that data to them, but no question, the large majority of people we spoke to were aware of the tariffs. They knew they were going to negatively impact Canada, and then as a result, negatively impact them as well. So with that, I mean, not that that's encouraging to hear, because we don't want that outcome, but it was encouraging in the sense that a lot of them were aware of it.
Now, this question is for all three of you, and I want to start with Kathy, and then we're going to go in reverse order from what I just did. So Kathy, then Allison, then Neil. I'm assuming, and I hate to assume on this show, but I'm going to for a few seconds if you don't mind. I'm going to assume that you all had group conversations with stakeholders, but also individual conversations with stakeholders. What specific message did you hear from the individual conversations that you were having at this convention? And what specific thing are you taking back with you, because you are heading back on the Tuesday morning, March 4th, to your respective provinces? What was the message that you specifically heard, Kathy?
So I think some of the common messages that I heard, and I think it's going to be a common theme, was that even when we were in a group setting presenting to large numbers in rooms, and then the one-offs after, was a lot of concern about the border, and the fentanyl was number one, I would think. We had a lot of, they want like specific examples, how much the housing is going to cost now to build in the United States, because they have a housing crisis. So that was an interest to them. The increase to a cost of a vehicle was a common thing. So it was like concrete things that, with numbers, that they related to. And obviously, like I said, the border was a hot topic. It felt like really they didn't get them, or hasn't been getting the message on the amount of enforcement and dollars that Canada has been putting into the border and to the fentanyl crisis. So there was definitely a disconnect there. So I think when I bring the message back, I think that the message is for all of Canada and all municipalities. There's a common theme of a message from what they're hearing. We provided concrete data to them to try and get a correct message across. But we bring the message that we have heard and what I just indicated to you back.
I'm going to ask, before I toss it over to Allison, I'm going to sort of pointedly ask a very pointed question. Kathy, do you think they heard you?
I think that they did hear us. And the reason I say yes to that is the one-off conversations where we were approached afterwards. And that was encouraging, that they heard data and information from us that they didn't know, or that they assumed that they knew, but it really wasn't the information that was maybe the truth. And we were definitely promoting the Connect to #2 Canada website, so that they could get very specific to their state and to their district on how it would affect them dollar-wise. So yes, I do believe they heard us. And to Neil's point, where some didn't believe us, it wouldn't have mattered what we said, but they heard us by just saying that and being a little bit retaliatory to us. So that's a clear indication that they did hear us, whether they liked it or not.
Yeah.
Allison,
Chris, I'm just going to jump in on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Allison, I think the key point is the data. If we have that data, that is key for them, because then they can bring it back to their communities and show how it affects them. Even while we were giving our speeches down here, and then we'd have question period where all three of us would be on stage and they're asking us questions. Some of them were, softballs that you can hit out of the park, and some were a little tougher. But even after some of those tougher questions were asked, we had other people in the crowd from, let's say it's Montana or New Hampshire, all across the nation down here, that were actually jumping and providing all the information back there. Some of those people already knew it. The lady from Michigan hopped up and said, do you realize that parts go back 8 times and 8 tariffs are going to impact the cost of a vehicle? We said, minimum of $3,000. They actually said, no, it probably is closer to $10,000 to $15,000.
Alison, over to you for a second from an Ontario perspective, because there is already, while we're talking about the potential cross-country global tariffs that will be imposed on Canadian goods and resources, there have been some tariffs already placed on some resources, and that's aluminum and steel, and that affects southwestern Ontario quite a bit because that is a large area, a large sector for southwestern Ontario where you're from. Did you hear any messages about how this is going to impact Michigan, New York, and even southwest Ontario?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually, before I came to Washington, I called up the CEO of one of our major employers in Chatham-Kent, which is an aluminum extrusion company, and they have satellite businesses in the southern U.S. And he was very concerned. I wanted to talk to folks who could be directly impacted this in my own community, and he did not mince words. He thought that, you know, within a fairly short period of time, talking months, we could see companies closing or at least negatively impacted. They're stopping their investment. They're stopping additional hiring. They're stopping, you know, potential expansion plans. So I heard that message loud and clear. I definitely, to Neil's point, when you talk about the border states, especially in the Great Lakes region where I am located, the automotive manufacturing, which it does have, like the steel and aluminum are part of that, definitely. There are people who are deeply concerned. And they often were well aware, as I mentioned earlier. We had a lot of one-on-one conversations like that. So from a Southwestern Ontario perspective, it's absolutely on our radar. From a local Chatham-Kent perspective, I am deeply concerned about it. We have an energy sector, we have an automotive sector, we have a manufacturing sector, and we have an aluminum sector. And those are four of several different categories that would impact my community directly. And we met with counterparts in states that were similar in economies, like Michigan, Ohio, New York, Wisconsin, that they know and they are concerned. So I was knowing that we're all on the same page on that front is good to know, because we're going to need, as we said to them regularly, we're going to need your help to talk to your congressmen and women to get that message up to other decision-making officers to make sure that they're aware of it as well.
Neil, for yourself, Alberta is a net exporter of the resource, whether that be oil and gas, into the United States. There's been talk about the Keystone XL pipeline being put on the table again and bringing crude oil down to the Gulf of America or Mexico, however you want to call it today. Was the topic of conversation around resources and the energy sector prominent in your discussions as the Alberta councillor in the room?
Yeah, it was. There was a pointed question from someone from Texas that asked that exact question. How is this going to affect this? And I just, we just said right point blank, if these tariffs go through, expect your price at the pump to go 10 to 20 cents a gallon more right off the hop. And people in the crowd, when you mention stats like that, it did catch them off guard. They're like, ooh, that will hurt us. And you talk, I'm going to tie that back into the agricultural sector. They're very worried about the potash. That was one thing that was brought up out of Saskatchewan, that how that's going to affect the agricultural district in the upper north states as well as in Canada for that matter too. And, you talk about the fuel, the potash, where are their margins coming from? That's chewing into their margins. So, if they can't buy as much, if there's too much of a cost, then their yields go down. So there's their margins right there. I mean, the energy sector was talked about, even though it's a different number, it's 10%, it's still a big number that we as Albertans and Canadians for that matter will be greatly impacted by.
I can just touch on that also, Chris, because of Manitoba's hydroelectricity power and how we sell to the states and fill some of the gaps on their grid. They did talk in one of our rooms that we were in about increased data centers in some states, but they're worried about their grids not having the infrastructure to support them. So I said, well, this is a clear example of a retaliatory tariff on the power we sell to you. Your data center and your infrastructure for data centers is going to substantially increase if these tariffs go through. So there was many different parts of the energy and resource sector that definitely was brought up.
Yeah, and on the data center side of things, Chris, there was one municipality in Virginia, in fact, they have 100 data centers in their municipality, which is huge. I think they're an outlier because most municipalities are talking about maybe having 3, 4, 5, 6. When they mentioned 100, power was one of the main constraints that they had in that area. And they're also mentioning that even though they have constraints on power, they don't know what to do with their money. So they're the one municipality down here that is touting how much money they have to spend, actually. Most are in the same boat as the rest of us sitting at this table going, where do we get the money to pay Peter to pay Paul, right?
While this mission, this delegation that all three of you are part of, is now wrapping up, what's the next steps for each one of you? Because you're all going to go home to your respective provinces, and I would hazard a guess to say that this is not where this conversation ends. I'm assuming you have made connections with stakeholders, municipal leaders across the states. What do you bring back to your respective provinces to continue this conversation? Is there invitations to AMO, to AMM, to RMA, to FCM? What are you specifically looking for from your provincial perspective to bring back? We'll start with Neil on that one.
So open invite to FCM for sure has been placed there. We've talked as early as our March meeting in Dorval, not saying that's going to work. It's probably more a convention topic being late May, early June. Continuing the dialogue that we've gained, because we've got a little Rolodex of cards now of different people across the country. And it's continuing things like we're doing with you here today, Chris, to try and get that message out there further. A gentleman from New Hampshire asked, will you be on a podcast? Yes, we will, of course. One in Denver. Will you be on a podcast there? Yes. If anything we can do to continue this dialogue, and I think even with some of the, I'm going to call it colder reception we got at times, even those people said, we need to continue this dialogue because it will help us move forward and find a solution moving forward.
Kathy, for yourself, what do you bring back to Manitoba, and what's the next steps for yourself?
Well, I think that there's two parts to that. One is there's a long-term strategy for FCM in this also, because this is an FCM-driven little road trip, I guess, that we are on with rural. And I think that clearly represents FCM is that, we have rural Alberta, we have rural Ontario, and we have northern Manitoba. But and I think that's what FCM wanted to provide, was the rural insight for Canada to this organization. So I think the next step for FCM is that they need to bring this information back federally to our federal government and develop a long-term strategy, because this isn't a file that now it's going to end tomorrow because we're getting on planes. This is going to be a file that we have to continually work on for years and years now. So that data we have to bring back. We have to bring back, I think, to our provincial governments also what we're hearing, because we see that our premiers are having to work together to take down some interprovincial barriers. So I think what we've heard here, we can also bring some insight back to our own provincial governments at that point also, to help to continue these conversations. But so I think there's two parts to it. There's an FCM overall strategy, and then what we can bring back definitely to our own provincial governments is key also.
Allison, for yourself, what do you bring back to Ontario, and what do you hope that you can share with the Ontario municipal leaders? Because I know you're quite ingrained in Ontario municipal life, and I know you know quite a lot of them because there's a lot there. But what do you hope to be able to bring back as a message and next steps for Ontario municipalities after this trip?
Yeah, we're talking to a lot of my municipal besties for sure. But yeah, similar to Neil and Kathy, I do think that there was such a value for us to be here, especially because now we're aware of a lot of the other organizations that exist within NACO, which was the conference we were at. There are different caucuses, different communities of interest within what is a very large organization like FCM is. And now we have specific committees we know we can connect with, specific caucuses we can connect with. We know a lot of their priorities as an organization, and we know how now to best, and we have a lot of faces to names of people that we can reach out to following up. So yes, this is the first conversation of many, we hope, over the coming years. So it's definitely not the end, it's just the beginning. From a more local perspective, absolutely. I did speak with the MPs in my region before I left, and they are on all sides of the aisle. We've got orange, blue, and red in my Southwestern Ontario area. So I'm going to be following up with them, and they were all very kind and generous with their own information to share with me before I left, and let them know how these conversations went. The Great Lakes Basin, as we call it, so the states and provinces around the Great Lakes, for me personally, those were networks and introductions and conversations that were very valuable. And to go right to the sort of hyper-local in Chatham-Kent, I think we need to start preparing for economic volatility in our community. I think we need to really start having some tough conversations from a municipal services perspective. What happens if we lose businesses? What happens if companies have to start laying off people or shutting their doors? And we have to have some really tough conversations about what that looks like in our community. We have experienced that before in the early 2000s, which was a devastating time when manufacturing kind of collapsed in the Rust Belt area. And it's scary to think we might be facing that again, but preparation is key. So if we can, be prepared for that economic hardship, and if at the 11th hour that gets removed, great. But what I'm going to be bringing back is, this could be a real thing very soon, and we need to be prepared. So there's lots of levels of messaging, and I think all three of us will be able to bring back the question.
Chris, I'm going to jump back in again. Sorry. I think that what we also have to look at is as Kathy mentioned, and Allison, this is not a short play. This is a long play. And I think what we have to bring back too is within our own provinces, our own communities, is that we are going to continue on this file. And I think that if we've learned anything out of this, we've had the same person on this file now for the last 3 trips down here. I've been on 2 of those. And when you walk into a room and they already know who that person is, that's opening up barriers that we didn't have before. So I think we need to, from a strategic play within FCM, we really need to make sure that this is staffed properly and address it properly, because when we address it through FCM, the trickle-down effect that's going to help our communities at home is going to be double the effect.
And it will help each of the provincial associations also, because FCM has taken the lead on this, representing all Canadian municipalities as the federal association. So all provincial associations now can learn and use the tools that FCM is bringing back and working on this file, which is huge for a local association and the provinces or in the territories also.
Now, I did not prepare you for this question, and I'm kind of because Allison just mentioned something, but I want to bring it local. I want to bring this tariff threat on Canadian goods to a very local perspective right now. We are, as of recording this, less than 12 hours away from potential tariffs. And I say 25% on consumer goods and 10% on resources. That could change by the time this airs. I'm just putting that out there right now. What is the local impact of your local economies, of Thompson, of Sturgeon County, of Chatham-Kent? Because I just recently got back from the Yellowknife, and I was speaking to municipal leaders up there, and I can tell you, and I did not expect Donald Trump and these tariffs to come up in conversation, but they were a conversation that was ongoing. Water, affordability, food crisis, this was on top of mind. How are these tariffs potentially going to impact your local economies? Or if you want to even go bigger, how is it going to impact the municipalities in your respective provinces if they do get implemented in the short term and long term? Kathy, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I think that, well, it's exactly what they're saying. It's the affordability for Canadians. It's going to be job loss in some of these plants that, whether it's the critical minerals sector or it's the aluminum plant in southern Manitoba and Selkirk, and It's the vehicles, you know, how many vehicles we sell in Thompson that represent all of northern Manitoba. So it's the same as there. It's going to be the affordability, the job loss, just the cost to do business in Manitoba and in Canada. It's going to affect us in every aspect of where and how we live in Thompson, Manitoba as a whole, as a province, the ag sector, definitely everything's going to be impacted.
And I'm going to build off of that as well, Chris, because the ag sector, we had just finished a meeting an hour ago about that, and everyone around that meeting acknowledged the ag sector is probably the first to be hit and impacted by this. And, you know, that impact is huge when you consider that, you know, quote unquote, spring is around the corner. And when their input costs are going through the roof, how is that going to affect us? And the affordability, it just spins right back to that as well. So, I mean, in Alberta, locally, that's where I'm most worried initially, is the ag sector as well as energy, obviously.
Allison, over to you. And then I have one final question for all three of you, and then I'm going to wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously alluded to it a little earlier, but definitely we're so integrated with the Midwest and the Great Lakes states and Southwestern Ontario and Southern Ontario. And it's not too much to understate that this could devastate our economies. I don't mean to sound alarmist, but we had the chief economist of the Conference Board of Canada, Pedro Antunes, come to Chatham-Kent just last week. And the tariffs, of course, came up. And he said this could literally permanently remove the manufacturing sector from our country. And as one of the farmers in our ag meeting this morning stated, he said, once you lose a market, it's almost impossible to get it back. And so to think that we would have to somehow rebuild or recover from that kind of economic shock is something that I don't think we've really wrapped our heads around yet, just because everything is so uncertain. Like you said, 12 hours from now, it could be a totally different story. I hope it is. But these, every community in both countries will be affected, because every community in every state, through the data that our FCM team brought for us, it shows that there is no community that will be untouched by these tariffs, because it touches on every sector of every economy. We're in the agricultural sector too. We have a large agribusiness community in Chatham-Kent. They're worried. We have large automotive manufacturers. I mean, I've mentioned a few of them already, but it's on their radar, and it is in the northern states and the border states too. So we're all hoping that our efforts these last couple of days, every conversation we had mattered. It really did. So I'm grateful for the opportunity.
So my final question, it's a quick answer if you don't mind, because I know I'm cautious of time and I know you guys have other meetings you probably want to get to, or you just want to relax before your next meeting. Looking at the last few days that you have been spending in Washington, D.C., you've had your detractors. You've had people who probably will never agree with us. We live in the municipal realm. You probably are well aware of the fact that not 100% of the people are ever going to agree with you. But from a local perspective, from Chatham-Kent, from Thompson, from Sturgeon County, was this a successful trip? And do you go away optimistic that people heard you, people understood what Canada is going through, and people understood that if these tariffs do get put into place, Canada and their neighbor, United States, will be impacted? Allison?
100%. 100% endorse this trip. And not just because I got the opportunity to go, and I was very honored to be invited, truly. But I think every conversation that we had mattered. Every person we spoke to one-on-one, every presentation, every panel that we spoke about, we had a Team Canada united approach. We had a strong message of the kind of impacts these tariffs would have on both sides of the border. Even the difficult conversations were useful, because we know what type of messaging and approach we can pivot and adapt to our follow-up conversation. So building relationships with your friends and neighbors is never a bad thing. And so to start to lay the foundation for the next 4 years and beyond, because it's a marathon, not a sprint, and to start building that foundation with our counterparts, as we always say, local government is the government of proximity, and that's the same in south of the border. So we see the impacts in our economies and our communities first. So to get those relationships going and to make those friendships, I am happy to have that opportunity. And we had a great team here to do it.
I want to go one podcast episode talking to FCM where I don't mention Scott Pierce's name, but it seems like I'm just going to continuously do it. Scott Pierce better like trademark government of proximity, because I
Yes.
think I owe him $1 million after this. Neil, from a rural perspective, as the FCM Rural Forum chair, was this a successful trip for rural Canada to be at this conference and hear the things that they're talking about? And as I asked Allison, that they understood that Canada and the United States are going to suffer if these come into play.
100%. At our last meeting, the representative that was sitting at the table from Minnesota acknowledged he's a hog producer himself. And he said he gets the wiener pigs from Canada, imports them to the United States, and finishes them off there. He said if these tariffs go on, that impacts his bottom line. And I think that, as Allison mentioned, it was used a lot, is you're our friends, you're our family. That was used a lot this week, not by us, by the Americans saying that about us. I even went, one of the harder topics that we had, conversations, questions, I did a pull aside and I grabbed her and I said, can I just have a frank conversation with you? And she said, sure, absolutely. So I just walked with her and I explained how this is affecting Canada. And I said, it's not that we're adversarial in this, but we need to figure out how to find a path moving forward. And she said she did understand that, even though she is fully a red tie Trump wearing person, don't get me wrong, but she said we just need to learn how to pivot our messaging a little better. And that's points taken by us. I may not completely agree with how she was saying to state those points, but can we change it a little bit? Sure. And that's part of the dialogue that we have to have, is figuring out what those common key points are. And I always say, if we can, let's try and get some of the low-hanging fruit first and then work on some of the bigger ones. Obviously, the sooner we do that, the better. We actually all walked away from that meeting saying, yes, let's have another meeting. Let's make sure this doesn't just end right here. And one of the conversations we had with NACO's CAO, he said, this has to continue not just in this next 4 years of Republican government. He said, as things change, it could be a Democratic government moving forward. And there were trade issues even back then that need to be talked about. So this is ongoing, not dependent on who's in play down here.
And Kathy, for you, as the second vice president of the Federation of Municipalities, municipalities have been at the forefront of this ongoing trade discussion between Canada and the United States. It seems like municipalities are now taking a more active role in advocating for local individual economies at the local municipal level. You are going to go back to Manitoba. You're going to speak to your FCM executive team. Was this a successful trip for municipalities, not just rural, but urban as well?
Absolutely. Every person that we spoke to was an elected official, just like every one of us. So those conversations that we had one-on-one, they know how important and what an impact this is going to be to their ratepayers, just like ours. So that's why building this relationship between the two associations and bringing this forward, what we're hearing, is crucial to move forward. Like Allison said, not just for the next 4 years. This is now something that we have to move together and work together, because with us being each other's biggest trading partners, we are going to be stronger if we work together. And that's what was so beneficial about coming here. And it's just a start. I mean, they were here, the premiers were here, and Neil and some FCM staff were here last week. And this is continuing. And this isn't just started with us. This has been work in the progress, and it's going to be work moving forward, and definitely beneficial.
A Team Canada approach, Chris.
And don't you worry. I let them know a few times that we won the hockey game.
Yeah.
Second Vice President Kathy Valentino, FCM Rural Forum Chair Neil Como, FCM Director Allison Story. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking about this. I feel like this is going to be an ongoing conversation that myself and at least one of you will probably be having over the next 4 years. So much appreciated for taking time out of your busy Washington trip to do this.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Municipal Affairs. Now, we hope you've enjoyed today's conversation and gained some valuable insights on what the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is doing to help protect the Canadian economy. To stay in the loop with all of our latest episodes, don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platforms or follow us on social media at Cross Border Network. For even more content and learn more about the people and stories that we feature on this show, visit us online at crossborderinterviews.ca. Your support means the world to us. So share this episode with your friends, your family, and help keep the conversation going. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll be back with a brand new episode of Municipal Affairs soon.